Backyard Professor videos. I've had occasion to ponder an idea that I heard recently again, and periodically you hear this what I'm going to call this jingoism, and it pays to examine the assumption. Whenever we hear something taught, or whenever we hear something said, it's okay to use our reasoning abilities we learned in school. It's okay to apply logic and careful critical analysis to our ideas. We need to do more of this. Now, when I say critical analysis, I don't mean critical as in finding fault. I mean critical as in careful, mature judgment, analyzing the facts, exploring what we're assuming when we teach something that may or may not be true. I think this is critical for us to do. The jingoism I'm talking about is the one we hear periodically where it says, "Follow the living prophets, not the dead ones." This particular jingoism is, well, I mean, it's catchy, you know, it kind of sounds clever, it's kind of cool. You say, oh yeah, follow the living prophets, not the dead ones. Because, of course, we have living prophets again, and it is important to understand their message and to listen to their instructions and teachings. What is the assumption, however, on this jingoism? Follow the living prophets, not the dead ones. The assumption is that the dead ones are gone, they're now out of date, they're probably useless, they're not near as relevant as the living prophets, and we should be getting our guidance through living revelation. And I did something that, and I do this all the time, and I'm going to reshare it with you because this works. So if you can do this, do it. I always have a pad of paper with me, with a pen. And as I ponder ideas and I think about them, I write down what comes to my mind. And this is interesting to do because some of the themes, some of the ideas you get are really interesting. It's quite fun and educational to see what comes to your mind when you explore thoughts on the scriptures, or say on a math problem. It doesn't matter what subject. On a mechanical problem you're having with your vehicle, on how better to save money on grocery shopping. I mean, it applies across the spectrum as far as that goes. As I've pondered this idea, follow the living prophets, not the dead ones, I've got several ideas that came to my head and I wrote them down, and so I'm going to share these with you. I'm going to show you why I do not believe that this jingoism is accurate. I think there's a more accurate, a more realistic possibility here. And this one's a false teaching, I believe. It's not meant to be taught as a false teaching. I mean, there's no viciousness when someone says this. There's no vicious intent. It's just, it's more out of, it's said more because we just don't simply analyze the assumptions. That's the problem here. Okay? So the first thing that came to my mind is when I heard this jingoism just recently is I was holding the priesthood manual, the teachings of the presidents of the church on George Albert Smith. And I thought, well, why? I mean, he's a dead prophet. So why are we bothering to study that manual? You see that issue? That was the first thing that came to my mind. A more serious concern is, what do we do with Joseph Smith then? You see, we'll follow the living prophet. The living prophet is Thomas S. Monson and the Quorum of the 12 in the First Presidency. You know, we have 15 of them that we sustain as prophets, seers, and revelators. But what's that do to Joseph Smith? You know. See, Joseph Smith taught us a veritable truth when he's pronounced the Book of Mormon is the most correct book and that man can get closer to God by abiding by its precepts than by any other book. But don't you see, the Book of Mormon is just a bunch of dead prophets. Yeah? And yet we have the prophet of the Restoration saying we should study those dead prophets. He didn't see them as being irrelevant or useless or out of date, now did he? Isn't that interesting? That's a point worth pondering, isn't it? Another idea that struck me, and I didn't write these in any particular order, I was just writing down as fast as the ideas came into my mind, which is what I would recommend you doing. But another really interesting idea is Jesus quoted Isaiah, again, a dead prophet, when he was sitting in the temple. He quoted Isaiah to the people, and then he said, "This day, this prophecy is fulfilled." You see, the dead prophet Isaiah had been dead for many centuries, but he was entirely relevant. Isn't that interesting? Jesus himself quoted the dead prophets. Well, you know, you can't help but say, well, look, if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me, you know, right? Yeah. Well, and then here's another idea in conjunction with this that caught my attention, was that our current prophets right now quote the dead prophets all the time, don't they? Well, I mean, Jesus, back to Jesus again. In the Book of Mormon, when we read about Christ's visit to the Americas, what did he tell those disciples that he personally chose? He said, search the scriptures, didn't he? Yes. In fact, he had them update the scriptures of some prophets and prophecies that hadn't been written down, and the prophet Nephi remembered that, and so he hurried and updated it because that dead prophet was relevant to their situation. So it was an updating of the dead prophets to be used, appreciated, and understood. And Jesus himself commanded that. It's a very interesting idea, isn't it? And with this idea of the follow the living prophets, not the dead ones, that is so wrong logically, as well as philosophically, as well as religiously, as well as doctrinally, it's just simply wrong, is what do you do with all the rest of the scriptures? You got the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price. All of those are dead prophets. You know, what do you do with the Wilford Woodruff Manifesto on Polygamy? What about President Kimball's revelation of the blacks getting the priesthood, etc.? Well, all of that's just a bunch of dead prophets now, so throw it out. You see the logical problem with this. When we begin to critically think through this and apply some reasoning and logic that we learned in school, how to think, then it dawns on us, this jingoism is not a good one. Not at all, because it takes away of all of the other scriptures. The Joseph Smith translation. How many months, years did Joseph Smith labor on the Bible itself and produce the Joseph Smith translation, which is more of a midrash, a commentary on the Bible, but Joseph Smith spent an enormous amount of his time on that subject. In fact, Joseph Smith went and learned the original languages of the Bible, the Hebrew and the Greek and so on and so forth, so that he could read the original prophets in their language, man. But they're all just a bunch of dead prophets. But Joseph Smith didn't see them as being irrelevant and not useful. Does that make sense? And yet another idea. And I'm not saying don't follow the living prophet. Oh no, not at all. It's very necessary to realize, recognize, study, analyze, follow the living prophet intelligently. Engage your mind and your reasoning and your heart in prayer and thought and analysis and cross-reference and cross-checking with what we have already. The dead prophets, this is the foundation. Now before you get excited, hold on. I know what you're thinking, some of you. Before you get excited, let's analyze this a little closer. We have a fabulous example with our own beloved prophet, Brother Joseph. Joseph is a young man, turned to a dead prophet. James 1:5, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth liberally to all men, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Well, this struck Joseph Smith particularly powerful, and using that dead prophet's advice, he went into the sacred grove, and the rest is history. Yes? Right? We wouldn't even exist as Mormonism, as a restoration, without that dead prophet James that struck Joseph so forcefully. The basis is the dead prophets. It's not an image of living prophets, dead prophets, get rid of the dead. No. Instead, I think the idea, the more accurate way to assess the relationship with the prophets now and then is the living prophets, the dead prophets, and they are united. We utilize all of the prophets and their writings together. It's not an either-or proposition. It is a both-and proposition. I believe that would be a more correct way to see the relationship. Does that make sense? The idea here, well, and then, and I wrote this down, I said, what would we know about the historical Jesus without those dead prophets and their recordings? You know, would we have a Sermon on the Mount? What about that magnificent John chapter 17 chapter, the intercessory prayer of Jesus to the Father? I mean, some of the most magnificent of Scripture we wouldn't even have if it wasn't for the dead prophets, you see, and their recordings. Matthew used the dead prophets. Now, all of the Gospels used the various prophets, but Matthew especially used them over and over and over again to find prophecies relating to Jesus' life, his virgin birth, his spirituality, his betrayal, his trial, his death, and his resurrection. Matthew went to the dead prophets to use them to show that all of this was prophesied. You see, the dead prophets were not irrelevant. They had the living Son of God with them. But the dead prophets weren't irrelevant to them. No, they used those, you see. Very interesting, isn't it? So the implication that the dead prophets are outdated, useless, no good compared to the living prophets, that's a false thinking, I think. That's not reasonable. Not based on the logic of our situation that we have within our religion. And then, the more I thought, the more I wrote down. So I got another idea that I thought through. The church every year picks one of the 4 books of the dead prophets. This year, we're studying the Book of Mormon. You know, we go to the Old Testament, the New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Sport of Great Prize. Every year, every 4th year, we rotate through them, and this is sanctioned by our living prophets to study those dead prophets, the Scriptures. But of course, you know, they advocate 15-minute Scripture study every single day. Oh, well, all right, well, what is Scripture except a bunch of dead prophets, you see? But they're not irrelevant. They're certainly not useless. They're very necessary. And our living prophets put that program together. So our living prophets don't think the dead prophets are irrelevant. Criminy, man. Our living prophets are constantly quoting from the dead prophets. Here in a couple of weeks, we're going to have general conference. You pay attention and watch. They'll quote the dead prophets in general conference in their talks. But of course, yes, because they are entirely relevant. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then, of course, the church, the last idea that dawned on me is the church is spending tens of millions of dollars to publish the Book of Mormon, a book of dead prophets. But we spend tens of millions of dollars. It's one of the most published printed books ever in existence right now. Were you aware of that? It's pretty exciting. It's pretty fascinating stuff. But we're spending an enormous amount of money. Well, if the dead prophets weren't relevant, if it's only the living prophets, we would be publishing the writings and teachings of Thomas S. Monson, not the Book of Mormon, you see. But because of the logic of this situation, because of the analyzing the relationship with the dead prophets in the Scripture and the living prophets with their living revelation, we understand it as a partnership, not an exclusive either or. It makes more sense to say this jingoism is not well thought through and it shouldn't be taught. It shouldn't be said very much. I'm certainly not going to teach it because I don't believe it. I don't believe that following the living prophets, not the dead ones, is the correct way. The correct way is follow all of God's prophets as you are moved upon by the Spirit. Do it intelligently, not blindly. We want to have critical thinking, critical, reasonable reasoning, logic, and thinking intelligently applied to following the living prophets. Absolutely. Not a blind faith. It's not because who it is that says what they say that we should follow and believe everything they say. No, we should prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. Yeah, I know, that's quoted by a dead prophet, but trust me, that's the way to do it. Every prophet has said that anyway, you know. So that's my thinking on this theme. It's a remarkably interesting theme. It's a very powerful theme. I mean, when you think about it, we have living prophets again today. Wow. You mean like Ezekiel, Isaiah, Daniel? Yes. Yes. Today, right now. Well, that's pretty dramatic. That's impressive. Well, what are they saying? What do they teach? Well, it's important to analyze and study what they say and teach and compare them with all of other prophets that God has chosen to raise for Israel and for the world. But you have to do it intelligently. You have to engage your brain and make it reasonable, because just like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel and Malachi and all of Paul the apostle, just like all of God's chosen servants, Peter, James, and John, all of them, they're just human. They really can make mistakes, and they really do, I promise. I know we love to put them on a higher pedestal than most. Joseph Smith forbade that. He said, nothing doing, man. You show mercy to me, I'll show mercy to you. You be lenient with me in my weaknesses, and I'll be lenient with you in your weaknesses, because we're all in this together. There is no infallibility in Mormonism. You want infallibility, you have to go 2 blocks down and to the right, and then you'll find the Catholic Church. They believe in infallibility of the Pope. We don't with the prophet. If there are the mistakes of men, condemn not the things of God, is how the Book of Mormon puts it. There is no infallibility in the most correct book either. So this is my idea. I hope you got something out of this. I did. I enjoy pondering things like that. When you ponder and think through things, man, have a tablet of paper with you and write your ideas down. It's awesome. Keep your journal that way. It's really quite fun and interesting. It'll amaze you what kind of information is out there in the cloud, as Steve Jobs used to love to call it. The cloud, yeah. It's all there, and it's accessible as we open that door, as we knock, ask, and receive and open that door. So, thanks for watching my videos. I will see you in the next video. You have a great day.